As a 34-year-old lead software architect living in Seattle, I was optimizing a massive database deployment when a catastrophic fraud alert from JP Chase confirmed my husband had just finalized $200,000 in secret loans using my social security number. The approval documents have already come into force. Every single cent was immediately wired to an offshore escrow account to purchase a luxury property entirely under his mother's name. My pristine financial reputation, built over a decade of relentless corporate grind, was instantly obliterated. I stared at my multiple monitors, the glowing lines of code blurring as the sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me. He had not just borrowed money, he had stolen my financial identity. The screen displayed a relentless cascade of newly opened credit lines, personal loans, and maxed-out balance transfers. He had systematically intercepted the physical mail for weeks, answering the security questions he knew by heart. The financial trap was fully armed and locked around my neck. The rain battered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown office, mirroring the sudden storm destroying my reality. I immediately dialed the fraud department, my fingers trembling as I gripped the phone. The representative on the other end was sympathetic but mechanically cold. Because we were legally married and residing at the same address, the bank classified this as a civil marital dispute rather than clear-cut identity theft. They could not simply freeze the dispersed funds. I was entirely responsible for the catastrophic debt he had just created. The interest rates were predatory, compounding daily, designed to drown the borrower in an inescapable abyss. If I stopped paying, my high-level security clearance could be revoked, and my professional life would crumble. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew my job required a flawless background check, which included financial stability. He had weaponized my own success against me. I pulled up the loan agreements on my secure laptop, tracing the digital footprints of his betrayal. He had utilized an unsecured lending platform, bypassing the usual manual verification by exploiting the pre-approved offers mailed directly to our house. He had forged my electronic signature on 24 different documents. The sheer volume of the paperwork proved this was not a sudden lapse in judgment. This was a premeditated, highly orchestrated financial assassination. The more I dug into the transaction history, the worse the reality became. He had not just bought the house. He had funded a lavish interior design package, purchasing high-end Italian furniture and expensive landscaping services. All of it was billed directly to the stolen credit lines. His mother was living like royalty, completely insulated from the financial apocalypse brewing under my name. Every time I refreshed the banking portal, another hidden fee materialized, sinking me deeper into the red. When I arrived at our pristine suburban home that evening, he was casually sitting on the leather sofa, sipping an expensive craft beer. He did not even look up from his phone when I dropped my heavy leather bag onto the hardwood floor. The sheer audacity of his relaxed posture sent a violent tremor of rage through my spine. He thought he had won. He thought I would just quietly absorb the damage to protect my precious career. I tossed the printed bank statements directly onto his lap. The thick stack of paper landed with a heavy, sickening thud. He glanced at the red-inked balances, his smug expression entirely undisturbed. There was no panic in his eyes, no remorse, only a chilling, calculated entitlement. He slowly took another sip of his drink before leaning back against the cushions. "It is family money now, so you need to calm down and accept it," he stated, his voice dripping with condescending authority. My chest tightened as the sheer toxicity of his words filled the silent room. He actually believed my life's work was his personal automated teller machine. He believed his mother deserved a debt-free luxury retirement funded by my stolen future. I demanded to know how he could justify destroying my credit for a woman who had spent the last 5 years openly criticizing every choice I ever made. "My mother deserves a nice home, and your credit score was just sitting there doing nothing," he replied, entirely indifferent to my shaking hands. That single sentence was the emotional stamp that severed my marriage. He did not see me as a partner. He saw me as a host organism to be drained. I walked into the kitchen, gripping the edge of the marble countertop until my knuckles turned completely white. My phone vibrated on the island. It was a text message from his mother, a gloating picture of her standing in front of a sprawling, freshly painted house. The caption thanked her wonderful son for taking such good care of her. She knew. She knew exactly whose blood was paying for those bricks. I felt a cold, terrifying clarity replace the burning panic in my chest. If I filed for divorce tomorrow, the legal system in this state would trap me in a nightmare. The predatory loans were legally attached to my social security number. A sudden divorce would trigger an agonizing, expensive court battle where I would bleed thousands of dollars in attorney fees. He was banking on my predictable, logical nature. He assumed I would panic, hire a lawyer, and try to negotiate a settlement where I absorbed the debt just to make him go away. I realized that reacting with immediate anger was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to play the victim in court, claiming he made a financial mistake while trying to provide for his poor, aging mother. I stared at my reflection in the dark window of the kitchen. As a software architect, my entire career was built on finding invisible vulnerabilities in complex systems and exploiting them. My husband had just built a massive, fraudulent financial structure. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He assumed his newly acquired assets were safe just because they were resting in his mother's name. I realized that taking this to the police would be a devastating gamble. White-collar marital fraud is notoriously difficult to prosecute without concrete proof of coercion. The police would tell me to get a divorce lawyer, and the lawyer would tell me to prepare for a multi-year battle. Meanwhile, the creditors would garnish my incredibly high corporate salary. I needed a weapon far more devastating than a standard divorce decree. I needed to separate my clean wealth from his toxic debt, and I needed his willing signature to do it. The irrevocable trust concept began forming in my mind like a flawless algorithm. If I could convince him that my own assets were suddenly at risk from a phantom corporate lawsuit, his innate greed would force him to agree to hide our remaining money. I dried my eyes, the tears completely vanishing, replaced by a dark, absolute resolve. I would not divorce him today. I would not pack my bags, and I would not scream. Instead, I would build a labyrinth of legal and financial destruction so airtight that by the time he realized he was trapped, he would have absolutely nothing left. I walked back into the living room, forcing my posture to slump, mimicking the exact defeat he was waiting to see. I sat on the opposite chair, covering my face with my hands, playing the role of the broken, helpless wife. I told him I was terrified, that my company was doing massive layoffs, and that I was worried we would lose everything if the economy crashed. I planted the very first seed of the trust trap. He smiled, a triumphant, greedy smirk, believing he had completely broken my spirit. He had absolutely no idea that the woman sitting across from him was already dead, and the architect of his total ruin had just taken her place. The phantom lawsuit required absolute perfection to successfully weaponize my husband's inherent greed against him. I woke up at 4 o'clock the following morning, the dark Seattle skyline offering a cold backdrop to the financial warfare I was about to initiate. To make him willingly surrender his legal rights to our remaining wealth, he needed to believe that a catastrophic threat was coming for his pockets. Drawing on my decade of experience as a software architect, I fabricated a highly convincing, utterly terrifying email thread. I created a fake legal notice from a fictitious Delaware shell corporation, claiming that a recent database deployment I managed had caused a massive, multi-million-dollar compliance breach. The next phase required a ruthless estate attorney who specialized in airtight asset protection. During my lunch break, I drove to a high-end law firm in Bellevue, paying the exorbitant retainer fee in cash so the transaction would never appear on our joint bank statements. The massive mahogany desk separated me from a sharp, unsmiling lawyer as I outlined exactly what I needed. I instructed him to draft the paperwork for an irrevocable trust, a legal fortress designed to hold assets completely out of reach from any future creditors or civil judgments. The fundamental beauty of an irrevocable trust is its absolute permanence. Once you transfer your money and property into the trust, you legally relinquish all ownership and control. I named my estranged aunt, a reclusive woman living completely off the grid in rural Montana, as the sole trustee. If my husband signed these specific papers, every single dollar we placed into that trust would be entirely inaccessible to him, forever protected under my aunt's legal authority. The lawyer warned me that this was a nuclear option, explaining that I would also lose direct control over the funds. I simply smiled, a cold and hollow expression, and told him to finalize the documents immediately. I did not care about quickly accessing the money right now. I only cared about ensuring my husband could never use it to save himself when the credit card debt exploded. By late afternoon, I held the heavy legal binder in my hands, feeling the immense weight of the trap I had just constructed. I returned home just as the sun began to set, deliberately messing up my hair and smudging my mascara to look entirely unhinged. When I walked through the front door, I dropped my heavy leather briefcase and let out a broken theatrical sob. My husband was lounging in the living room, watching television, but he instantly muted the screen when he saw my fabricated panic. I thrust the fake legal emails into his hands, my voice trembling perfectly as I spun the narrative of my impending professional doom. I cried hysterically, claiming my company was preparing to sue me for millions due to a catastrophic coding error that exposed sensitive client data. I watched his eyes dart across the fabricated legal jargon, tracing the aggressive threats of personal asset seizure. The smug, entitled demeanor he had carried the night before vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, visceral panic. His breathing quickened as he realized that if I went down, my massive corporate salary would disappear, and the corporate creditors would inevitably come looking for shared marital assets. He paced across the hardwood floor, cursing loudly and running his hands through his hair in absolute distress. I played the role of the helpless, terrified wife with award-winning precision. I told him the corporate lawyers were ruthless and that they would inevitably discover the offshore escrow account and the luxury house he had just bought for his mother. That specific threat struck the exact nerve I was aiming for. The mere thought of losing his mother's new property terrified him more than anything else in the world. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip tight and desperate, begging me to find a solution before the phantom lawsuit drained everything we had. I waited for the perfect moment, letting the silence stretch out until his anxiety reached an absolute boiling point. Then I slowly pulled the heavy legal binder from my briefcase and placed it onto the glass coffee table. I explained that I had frantically consulted a top-tier asset protection attorney earlier that day to shield our remaining savings. I told him the only way to protect the equity in our current home and our joint investment portfolios was to immediately transfer everything into a blind, irrevocable trust. I lied flawlessly, assuring him that this was just a temporary measure to hide our wealth from the corporate vultures. I promised him that once the lawsuit blew over in a few years, we could quietly dissolve the trust and reclaim our money. He stared at the signature lines, visibly hesitating as his natural greed battled against his fear of the fake lawsuit. He asked why my estranged aunt had to be the trustee, and I immediately countered with pure, manipulative logic. I explained that having a neutral third party residing in a completely different state made the trust practically impenetrable to local corporate auditors. "Just make sure my mother's house is completely protected from your corporate mess," he demanded, his pen hovering over the final signature line. "I promise you, everything you truly deserve is completely secured," I replied, masking the venom in my voice with a perfectly executed, trembling whisper. The promise of securing my massive annual bonus for himself was the ultimate bait. He reached for the black pen sitting on the table, completely unaware that he was about to sign away his entire financial future. He did not bother reading the fine print detailing the irrevocable nature of the transfer. He simply scrawled his signature across 4 different pages, legally surrendering his rights to every single dollar we had painstakingly saved over the last 7 years. We drove to a local 24-hour shipping center that same evening to have the documents officially notarized. The fluorescent lights hummed above us as the clerk stamped the paperwork, her heavy metal seal echoing loudly in the quiet store. That sharp, metallic sound was the sound of the trap snapping shut. My husband walked out to the car, letting out a massive sigh of relief, genuinely believing he had just outsmarted the legal system. He had absolutely no idea that I had just successfully isolated all my clean wealth, leaving him alone in the blast radius of the massive debt he had created. Tomorrow morning, the real warfare would begin. With the irrevocable trust fully executed and safely mailed to my aunt in Montana, my personal assets were completely untouchable. The massive, fraudulent credit card bills he had racked up under my social security number were about to reach their first billing cycle. The trap was locked, the key was destroyed, and I was finally ready to stop making the payments. The sudden silence of a cancelled automatic payment is arguably the loudest, most terrifying sound in the modern financial world. It was a cold Tuesday morning when I opened my secure laptop and systematically disabled every single autopay feature linked to my stolen identity. I watched the digital toggles slide slowly from green to gray, permanently cutting the financial life support on the $200,000 of fraudulent debt my husband had created. The first billing cycles for the high-yield personal loans and premium credit cards were due in exactly 48 hours. I poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee, staring at the relentless Seattle rain beating against the glass, patiently waiting for the very first domino to fall. The strategy I had deployed was brutally simple but required absolute discipline to execute. Because of the phantom lawsuit I had meticulously fabricated earlier that month, I had already convinced my husband that my lucrative corporate salary was being temporarily frozen by the court system. I told him, with a perfectly staged tremor in my voice, that we had to survive strictly on his modest income as a mid-level marketing manager until the legal dust finally settled. He had grumbled and complained but ultimately agreed, still completely blinded by the fact that he thought our massive shared savings were safely hidden in the irrevocable trust. He had absolutely no idea that his mediocre bi-weekly paycheck was about to face the full predatory wrath of 24 maxed-out credit accounts. The initial late fees slammed into our accounts by late Friday afternoon. The penalty annual percentage rate skyrocketed instantly, jumping to the maximum legal limit and triggering a cascading avalanche of default clauses across multiple banking institutions. Because he had deliberately bypassed the usual manual verification processes by exploiting pre-approved offers, the automated lenders were incredibly aggressive. These were unsecured personal loans, meaning the precise moment a single payment was missed, the algorithmic collection engines shifted into maximum overdrive. My personal phone began buzzing relentlessly with urgent, automated text warnings, but I simply set the device to silent mode and tossed it deeply into my locked desk drawer. The very first real casualty of this sudden cash flow freeze was not my husband but his deeply entitled mother. She had arrogantly hired a premium landscaping crew to install a custom, natural stone waterfall feature in the expansive backyard of her newly purchased luxury home. On Wednesday afternoon, the head contractor attempted to process the massive final payment using one of the stolen credit cards my husband had provided to her. The mobile payment terminal violently rejected the transaction. The card was not just declined. It was completely frozen by the fraud department due to sudden, severe non-payment and suspicious over-limit activity. My husband's mobile phone rang abruptly while we were sitting in the kitchen preparing dinner. It was his mother, her voice incredibly shrill, echoing loudly and hysterically through the receiver. She was entirely humiliated in front of the workers. The aggressive contractors had abruptly stopped working, leaving a massive, muddy crater in her pristine new lawn, and were loudly refusing to leave the property until they were fully compensated in cash. My husband's face flushed a bright, angry red as he paced frantically around the kitchen island, desperately trying to calm her down and salvage her shattered pride. He promised her it was just a simple, temporary banking error and swore that he would transfer the necessary funds immediately. I sat perfectly still at the heavy wooden kitchen table, casually sipping a glass of iced water, watching him open his banking application on his phone. The color rapidly drained from his face as the loading screen vanished. He tapped the glass screen harder, his breathing suddenly hitching violently in his throat. He was instinctively trying to transfer money from our primary joint savings account, completely forgetting the binding legal reality of what he had signed just a few weeks ago. The account balance displayed a bold, mocking zero. "Where is the money?" he demanded, his voice cracking with sudden, unadulterated panic as he stared at me wildly. "It is in the irrevocable trust, exactly where you wanted it to be," I replied softly, offering him a look of deep, perfectly fabricated sympathy that mirrored his own manipulation. I reminded him, utilizing a tone of agonizing patience, that we had transferred every single liquid asset to my estranged aunt in Montana to shield our wealth from the corporate lawyers. I explained that the massive funds were now legally locked away and utterly inaccessible to either of us without triggering the attention of the phantom auditors. I sat back and watched the horrifying, suffocating realization slowly wash over his features as the financial trap finally snapped completely shut around his throat. He began to hyperventilate, his trembling fingers frantically navigating the banking application, desperately searching for any hidden reserves or forgotten accounts. But there was absolutely nothing left. His own meager checking account held barely enough to cover his upcoming car payment, let alone the tens of thousands of dollars in newly generated overdue minimum payments and angry contractor fees. The massive financial safety net he had relied on his entire adult life had simply vanished into thin air. He had eagerly traded his access to our hard-earned wealth for the illusion of protecting it, and now he was drowning in the deep end. The kitchen phone rang. This time it was not his weeping mother. It was the very first wave of aggressive third-party debt collectors. Because he had foolishly used our home landline as the primary contact number on several of the fraudulent loan applications to appear more stable, the hostile calls bypassed my silent mobile phone entirely. The sharp, obnoxious ringing of the landline pierced the tense, heavy silence of the room like a physical blow. He stared at the glowing caller identification display, frozen in absolute terror, instantly recognizing the toll-free area code of a major collection agency. I did not move a single muscle to answer it. I simply sat there and watched him sweat. He was finally experiencing the suffocating, crushing pressure of the massive debt he had so casually anchored to my name. He had smugly assumed that manipulating my immaculate credit score was a brilliant, victimless crime, a clever loophole to permanently fund his family's luxurious lifestyle at my expense. He never once anticipated that the financial executioner would come knocking directly on his own front door while his pockets were completely empty. The answering machine finally clicked on, its robotic voice filling the tense room. A stern, deeply aggressive representative stated they were attempting to collect a massive, severely overdue debt and explicitly warned of impending, severe legal action. My husband slowly slumped against the cold marble counter, burying his face deep into his shaking hands. The power dynamic of our toxic marriage had permanently shifted. The arrogant predator was now the helpless prey, and the relentless collection calls had only just begun. The desperate search for instant liquidity always breeds catastrophic, irreversible decisions. The continuous, piercing ringing of the heavy plastic landline rapidly became the oppressive, suffocating soundtrack of our otherwise quiet suburban household. My husband spent the entire brutal weekend aggressively dodging incoming calls from dozens of unknown numbers, pacing the length of our expansive living room like a terrified, trapped animal. The aggressive landscaping contractors had effectively laid a hostile siege to his mother's newly purchased property. They were loudly threatening to file a devastating mechanics lien against the luxury house if they did not receive their final cash payment immediately. He had spent 2 agonizing days frantically dialing his old fraternity brothers and wealthy college friends, desperately begging for short-term personal loans under the humiliating, fabricated guise of a sudden, catastrophic family emergency. Every single one of them politely but firmly declined his frantic requests, citing their own complicated financial struggles or simply sending his desperate, breathless voicemails straight to the deletion folder. He was utterly, devastatingly isolated. The carefully curated illusion of his massive success, built over years of wearing expensive tailored clothes and hosting lavish corporate dinners, had completely evaporated into thin air. He was finally experiencing the brutal, isolating reality of the financial destitution he had enthusiastically intended for me. By early Monday morning, his absolute desperation reached a terrifying, unprecedented new peak. I sat quietly at the marble kitchen island, sipping my dark roast coffee, and watched him discreetly slip his heavy, expensive vintage wristwatch into his wool coat pocket before leaving for work. It was the lavish anniversary gift I had proudly purchased for him exactly 3 years ago, a physical symbol of my hard-earned corporate success that he absolutely loved to flaunt at his mid-level marketing firm. I knew exactly where he was going, and I knew exactly what he was about to do. He was heading straight into the predatory, unforgiving underworld of short-term collateral lending. Once his car pulled out of the driveway, I immediately utilized my secure corporate laptop to monitor the hidden digital tracking device I had discreetly installed inside his vehicle several months ago. The glowing red dot on the digital satellite map moved rapidly away from his sleek, glass-walled corporate office building. Instead, it parked firmly in the cracked asphalt lot of a notoriously aggressive pawn shop and payday loan center, located right next to a dilapidated 7-Eleven. He was actively trading a $5,000 luxury timepiece for a pathetic fraction of its true market value, just to temporarily appease the angry contractors currently terrorizing his deeply entitled mother. He did not just stop at the pawn shop. The glowing digital dot slowly crawled across the city map and parked in front of a neon-lit auto title loan agency. Because his modern luxury sedan was completely paid off, it was the very last piece of legitimate collateral he legally possessed outside of the untouchable irrevocable trust. He was willingly handing over the physical title of his only vehicle to a predatory lender charging an astronomical, triple-digit annual interest rate. He was signing away the car he desperately needed to commute to his job, trading his daily transportation for a temporary stack of heavily taxed cash. When he finally returned to our silent, darkened home that evening, He walked with a heavy, deeply defeated slump, the expensive silver watch noticeably absent from his wrist. He tossed a thick, yellow paper envelope stuffed tightly with physical cash onto the granite kitchen counter. His knuckles were completely white, and his hands were still trembling visibly from the deeply humiliating transactions he had endured all afternoon. He immediately grabbed his mobile phone and called his mother, his voice strained, hollow, and utterly exhausted. He loudly instructed her to pay the aggressive workers in cash and begged them to quietly remove their heavy equipment from her pristine property. He genuinely thought he had successfully stopped the massive financial bleeding. He completely failed to realize that pawning his anniversary watch and mortgaging his only vehicle was nothing more than a pathetic, tiny bandage applied directly over a massive, spraying arterial wound. The thick envelope of dirty cash successfully neutralized the angry landscapers, but it did absolutely nothing to address the terrifying, looming wave of credit card minimum payments rapidly approaching their final deadlines. The major national banking institutions were not local, easily intimidated contractors. They did not negotiate emotionally, and they absolutely did not accept physical paper cash dropped off randomly at a suburban doorstep. They aggressively demanded strict electronic compliance, and our digital banking accounts were still completely, hopelessly paralyzed. The situation drastically escalated the very next afternoon when a frantic, tearful text message from his mother lit up his phone screen. Because he had cleverly tied all of her new household utility accounts to one of the stolen high-limit premium credit cards to earn travel rewards, the sudden failure of the automated payments triggered an immediate, devastating reaction. The local power company had just remotely disconnected the electricity to her massive luxury home. She was sitting entirely alone in the pitch black, her expensive new refrigerators slowly warming, completely cut off from the comfortable, lavish lifestyle she believed she rightfully deserved. Later that exact same night, the heavy plastic kitchen phone violently shattered the tense silence once again. This time, my husband did not freeze in terror. He snapped completely. He snatched the heavy receiver off the wall hook with a sudden, explosive burst of absolute, unhinged rage. He screamed furiously into the plastic mouthpiece, loudly demanding the aggressive collection agency stop harassing his private home. He desperately threatened to hire an expensive lawyer to sue their entire corporation for severe emotional distress and illegal harassment. It was the deeply pathetic, entirely toothless threat of a thoroughly broken, completely powerless man. "You cannot squeeze blood from a stone, so stop calling my house before I have you arrested," he roared into the receiver, his face flushed a dark, terrifying shade of purple with intense fury. "The debt is legally attached to this residential address, sir, and the mandatory next step is a full corporate wage garnishment." The robotic, perfectly calm, and utterly merciless voice of the senior collection agent echoed loudly through the activated speakerphone. The sudden clinical mention of an aggressive wage garnishment instantly extinguished the fiery explosive rage burning in his widened eyes, completely replacing it with pure, suffocating horror. If the aggressive corporate creditors legally seized a massive percentage of his modest biweekly marketing paycheck directly from his employer, he would not even have enough remaining money to buy basic groceries or put cheap gas into his heavily mortgaged car. The airtight irrevocable trust strictly prevented him from ever touching our massive joint savings, and his own pathetic salary was about to be legally hijacked by the exact same financial monster he had deliberately created to destroy me. I slowly closed the heavy lid of my laptop, smiling quietly in the dark shadows of the living room, perfectly aware that the heavy financial guillotine was finally locked tightly into position directly over his neck. The corporate humiliation of a sudden wage garnishment notice is a uniquely devastating psychological blow. In the ruthless American corporate ecosystem, your financial stability is directly tied to your professional reliability. Early Thursday morning, the hostile collection agencies bypassed our residential landline entirely and began flooding the main reception desk of his prestigious marketing firm. The robotic debt collectors demanded to speak directly with his human resources manager regarding a severe, delinquent financial obligation. They left highly detailed, incredibly embarrassing voicemails on the general office system, ensuring that his deeply private financial ruin became an instant topic of vicious office gossip. I sat in my quiet home office, casually sipping my dark espresso, and methodically monitored his public professional profile. I knew exactly how his incredibly strict, image-conscious employer operated. Mid-level marketing managers were expected to project absolute success, not field aggressive calls from predatory lenders disrupting the entire corporate office ecosystem. He had spent years meticulously building a fake persona of a wealthy, elite executive, wearing expensive tailored Italian suits to command respect. Now, the receptionist, the office manager, and his direct supervisors were all vividly aware that he was drowning in massive, unmanageable consumer debt. His carefully constructed professional facade was rapidly disintegrating in front of his colleagues, severely damaging his chances for any future promotions or executive bonuses. The real devastation hit when the first official payroll cycle of the month finally processed through the corporate accounting system. We used the exact same national payroll provider, a massive corporate entity called Automatic Data Processing, which made it incredibly easy for me to predict exactly when his digital pay stub would generate. When he stumbled through the front door that evening, his tailored suit jacket was severely wrinkled, and his expensive silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He did not say a single word to me as he walked directly to the granite kitchen counter. He opened his laptop with visibly trembling hands and logged into his employee portal to view his bi-weekly direct deposit. I watched quietly from the living room sofa as all the remaining color rapidly drained from his face. The aggressive collection agency had successfully executed a fast-tracked administrative wage garnishment. The absolute maximum legal limit allowable by state law had been brutally sliced right off the top of his gross earnings. After the standard income taxes and his mandatory health insurance premiums were automatically deducted, the final net deposit hitting his checking account was a pathetic, deeply insulting fraction of his usual salary. It was barely enough money to buy 2 small bags of groceries, let alone cover the exorbitant monthly rent for his mother's luxury home. He collapsed heavily onto the wooden kitchen stool, staring blankly at the glowing screen as if he were looking at a tragic, fatal accident. The sudden, agonizing realization that his hard-earned daily labor was now being automatically funneled to pay for the massive fraud he committed against me completely broke his spirit. He had eagerly stolen my identity to fund his family's luxurious lifestyle, smugly assuming I would just quietly absorb the financial damage. The situation deteriorated even further when his mobile phone began vibrating aggressively against the granite countertop. It was his mother, calling from a borrowed prepaid cell phone because her premium telecommunications account had also been officially suspended for severe non-payment. She was hysterically demanding the large cash transfer he had firmly promised her just 3 days ago. She loudly complained that the Neighborhood Homeowners Association was threatening to fine her daily because the massive dirt crater left by the angry landscapers was violating the strict community aesthetic guidelines. He stared at the ringing phone, his hands shaking violently, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his absolute failure. He could not answer the call because he had absolutely nothing left to offer her. The massive, fraudulent financial empire he had eagerly built to secure her luxurious retirement had completely collapsed in less than a single week. He was forced to endure the agonizing psychological torture of listening to his own mother leave a desperate, weeping voicemail, begging for the financial salvation he could no longer provide. "They took almost everything from my check," he whispered, his voice cracking with a pathetic, hollow vulnerability. "That is just standard corporate protocol when you default on massive unsecured personal loans," I replied coldly, completely devoid of any emotional sympathy. I deliberately offered absolutely no financial assistance. This was the highly controversial, agonizing boundary I absolutely refused to cross. A softer, more forgiving woman might have offered to spot him gas money for the upcoming week, feeling a fleeting pang of moral guilt for the brutal severity of the trap. But I felt absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction, actively choosing to let him starve in the toxic bed he had maliciously made. The absolute peak of his profound humiliation arrived precisely at midnight. Because his drastically garnished paycheck left him completely unable to make his very first mandatory cash interest payment, the aggressive default clause in his auto title loan contract was instantly triggered. A loud, heavy diesel engine suddenly rumbled to life directly outside our dark bedroom window, completely shattering the quiet suburban silence. He bolted out of bed, sprinting to the bedroom window in a sheer, blind panic. A massive, heavily modified tow truck was rapidly reversing into our private driveway. The flashing amber lights brightly illuminated the deep terror on his face as the hydraulic lift seamlessly locked onto the front tires of his sleek luxury sedan. He desperately threw open the glass window, screaming frantically into the freezing night air, begging the driver to stop. The operator completely ignored him, professionally securing the heavy metal chains before violently dragging the vehicle out into the dark street. The arrogant man who had proudly stolen my financial future was now standing barefoot in the cold, staring at an empty driveway. He was completely stripped of his money, his professional dignity, and his absolute final means of physical escape. I remained perfectly still under the warm-down comforter, knowing the trap had successfully neutralized his mobility and his pride. The brutal reality of public transportation is a sharp, unforgiving shock to a shattered corporate ego. At exactly 6 o'clock the following morning, the torrential Seattle rain relentlessly punished my husband as he stood completely unsheltered at the local transit stop. Without his repossessed luxury sedan, he was forced to endure a deeply humiliating, hour-long commute on a crowded, damp city bus just to reach his marketing firm. I watched from the warmth of our second-story bedroom window as a massive puddle splashed dirty street water onto his expensive Italian leather shoes. The meticulously crafted illusion of his executive superiority was now physically dissolving in the freezing morning downpour. He was a broken man, traveling to a job that barely paid him enough to survive the massive wage garnishments actively bleeding his accounts dry. By mid-morning, the quiet sanctuary of my home office was abruptly shattered by a violent, frantic pounding on the heavy oak front door. I slowly descended the sweeping hardwood staircase, glancing briefly through the security camera monitor. Standing on my pristine front porch was his incredibly entitled mother, shivering violently inside her expensive cashmere coat, tightly gripping the handle of an oversized designer suitcase. Because the local utility company had permanently severed the electricity to her massive new property, she had spent the entire freezing night huddled in the pitch black. She had impulsively hired a premium rideshare service to escape the freezing temperatures, arrogantly assuming she could simply invade my home and demand immediate financial salvation. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the heavy door open, offering her an entirely blank, emotionally hollow expression. She immediately barged past me into the warm, brightly lit foyer, entirely ignoring basic social boundaries as she carelessly dropped her heavy luggage onto the polished floor. Her usually perfectly styled hair was a chaotic, frizzy mess, and her deeply wrinkled face was contorted into a mask of pure, self-righteous fury. She did not offer a polite greeting or acknowledge the massive disruption she was causing. She simply pointed a perfectly manicured, trembling finger directly at my chest, loudly demanding to know why her beloved son was completely ignoring her frantic text messages. She furiously ordered me to immediately transfer a massive sum of money into her personal checking account to restore the power at her luxury estate. She arrogantly claimed that as a high-earning software architect, it was my fundamental, absolute duty to support the matriarch of the family during a temporary financial misunderstanding. Her sheer, unwavering audacity was genuinely breathtaking. She was standing inside the very home I had personally financed, relentlessly demanding I use my corporate salary to rescue the fraudulent luxury property she had knowingly purchased with my stolen identity. She still firmly believed she held the absolute moral high ground, completely unaware that she was standing entirely unarmed in the middle of an active minefield. I slowly walked into the expansive kitchen, casually pouring myself a fresh glass of sparkling water before finally addressing her ridiculous demands. I maintained a low, perfectly controlled tone, completely devoid of the hysterical panic she was desperately hoping to provoke. I calmly informed her that her beloved son was currently unreachable because he was riding a crowded public bus to work, having lost his vehicle to a ruthless nocturnal repossession. I watched her faded blue eyes widen in sudden, genuine shock as the initial wave of reality finally breached her impenetrable wall of absolute denial. She immediately began screaming, her shrill voice echoing violently off the high ceiling, angrily accusing me of maliciously hoarding our marital wealth. She furiously threatened to hire a ruthless divorce attorney to force the immediate sale of this very house, proudly declaring that her son was legally entitled to exactly half of my massive corporate assets. It was the exact, predictable threat I had been patiently waiting to hear. I smiled, a slow, dark, and utterly merciless expression that instantly caused the hostile shouting to completely die in her throat. I calmly opened the heavy oak drawer of my kitchen island and pulled out a pristine, notarized photocopy of the irrevocable trust agreement. I tossed the thick stack of legal documents directly onto the granite countertop, sliding them smoothly across the polished stone until they rested perfectly in front of her trembling hands. I politely invited her to carefully read the specific clauses outlining the absolute, permanent transfer of our joint wealth. I explicitly highlighted the final page, where her brilliant, incredibly greedy son had willingly signed away his legal rights to every single dollar we owned. I watched her trace his familiar, sweeping signature with her index finger, her breathing rapidly accelerating as the terrifying legal reality finally crystallized in her mind. I thoroughly explained that the massive financial safety net she was relentlessly relying upon had been entirely legally vaporized. Her son owned absolutely nothing in this house, and no hostile divorce attorney could ever penetrate the ironclad walls of the Montana Trust. I clinically detailed the severe wage garnishments actively draining his meager salary, firmly establishing that he lacked the financial capacity to even buy her a cheap meal, let alone fund the exorbitant property taxes on a stolen luxury home. The arrogant, demanding matriarch suddenly collapsed onto the wooden kitchen stool, her expensive cashmere coat looking incredibly heavy as she buried her face in her hands. "You entirely destroyed him just to punish me," she whispered, her voice cracking with a sudden, suffocating terror. "He entirely destroyed himself the exact moment he forged my signature, and I am simply allowing the natural consequences to beautifully run their course," I replied smoothly, staring down at her broken posture. I completely refused to offer her a guest bedroom, firmly instructing her to utilize the exact same rideshare application to find a cheap roadside motel. As she slowly dragged her heavy suitcase back out into the freezing Seattle rain, her mobile phone began to loudly ring. It was her son, finally calling her back during his pathetic lunch break. I stood on the warm porch, listening to the sudden, explosive venom in her voice as she viciously turned all of her terrified rage directly onto him. The toxic, fraudulent alliance between mother and son had completely shattered, and they were finally beginning to eat each other alive. The desperate delusion of a trapped man often masquerades as aggressive legal strategy. Late Friday evening, my husband finally returned to our silent suburban home after enduring another exhausting, humiliating week of riding the crowded public transit system. His usually pristine designer trench coat was thoroughly soaked from the relentless Seattle drizzle, and his expensive leather briefcase looked battered and worn. He walked through the front door with an unexpected, entirely fabricated swagger, tossing a cheap manila folder onto the glass coffee table with a loud, defiant slap. He mistakenly believed he had finally found a miraculous loophole to escape the devastating financial prison he had built. The sheer physical toll of his new reality was becoming impossible to hide. His expensive tailored suits were beginning to sag on his rapidly thinning frame, a direct result of skipping expensive corporate lunches because his severely garnished bank accounts violently declined every single transaction. The other mid-level executives at his prestigious firm had undoubtedly noticed his sudden, drastic decline, whispering quietly by the office espresso machine as his carefully curated aura of absolute superiority completely rotted away from the inside out. He was physically deteriorating right before my eyes, heavily burdened by the massive invisible chains of high-interest financial ruin. I sat quietly on the velvet living room sofa, reading a complex technical manual, completely unfazed by his sudden theatrical display. He smugly announced that he had spent his entire lunch break consulting with a highly aggressive civil litigation attorney in downtown Bellevue. He confidently claimed this new lawyer was an absolute expert at piercing corporate veils and dismantling complex financial structures. He proudly declared that they were preparing to file a massive lawsuit to violently dissolve the Montana Irrevocable Trust, loudly demanding the immediate return of his legally surrendered assets. I slowly closed my heavy textbook, offering him a look of profound, deeply insulting pity. I calmly asked him how he intended to pay the exorbitant upfront retainer fee required to launch a multi-state federal lawsuit against a legally bulletproof entity. The arrogant smirk immediately vanished from his exhausted face, replaced by a sudden, nervous twitch in his jaw. The attorney he had visited was notoriously predatory, known for aggressively bleeding desperate clients dry before inevitably dropping their impossible cases. I knew with absolute certainty that the moment this sleazy lawyer actually read the ironclad clauses drafted by my premium estate firm, he would sprint in the opposite direction. He puffed out his chest, defensively claiming that this incredible attorney had agreed to take his complicated case on a strict contingency basis, promising to collect their massive fee only after they successfully cracked the trust open. It was a spectacular, thoroughly pathetic lie. No legitimate estate attorney in the entire country would ever gamble hundreds of billable hours trying to magically reverse a flawlessly executed, voluntarily signed legal document. He was grasping at invisible straws, trying to project strength while actively drowning in a bottomless ocean of high-interest debt. I coldly informed him that his mother had recently visited our home, seeking emergency sanctuary after the utility company completely severed her power. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated horror as I meticulously described how I had firmly denied her entry, forcing her to drag her heavy designer luggage through the freezing rain. His mother was now completely isolated in a cheap, notoriously dangerous roadside motel. Entirely devoid of the premium luxury amenities, she firmly believed she was naturally entitled to enjoy. Before he could articulate a single syllable of his terrified rage, his mobile phone shattered the heavy silence of the living room. It was not a text message. It was a frantic, incoming call from his mother, who was currently trespassing on the front lawn of her darkened, freezing luxury property. He answered the call with shaking hands, automatically placing the device on speakerphone in his panicked state. Her voice was completely unrecognizable, a shrill, hysterical shriek that echoed violently against the high walls of our home. She was sobbing uncontrollably, hysterically explaining that a heavily armed county sheriff had just visited the darkened property while she was attempting to retrieve some personal belongings. The grim officer had unceremoniously hammered a massive, bright yellow notice of default directly onto her beautiful custom mahogany front door, officially declaring the property utterly delinquent, because the stolen credit cards actively funding the massive, newly established mortgage had completely failed during their very first billing cycle. The primary banking institution had aggressively initiated an expedited legal foreclosure process. The heavy mobile phone slipped directly through his trembling fingers, crashing loudly against the hardwood floor, the speaker still broadcasting his mother's agonizing wails. His cheap legal folders suddenly looked incredibly pathetic lying on the coffee table, a useless stack of generic paper completely powerless against the massive corporate machinery currently crushing his family. He collapsed onto his knees in the middle of the living room, gripping his hair with both hands, finally broken by the sheer, insurmountable weight of the catastrophic reality. He looked up at me, his eyes devoid of the arrogant entitlement that had defined our entire toxic marriage. He finally understood that the phantom corporate lawsuit I had fabricated to trick him into signing the trust was never real. He realized that I had deliberately orchestrated every single phase of his absolute destruction, using his own magnificent greed as the primary weapon. The massive financial safety net was completely gone, his professional reputation was thoroughly shattered, and the stolen house was permanently lost. "You planned every single second of this to watch us burn," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of absolute awe and suffocating terror. "I simply built a flawless mirror, and you willingly chose to shatter yourself against it," I replied coldly, standing up from the comfortable sofa and walking towards the kitchen without looking back. The trap was now completely empty of any valuable resources, leaving him alone in the toxic wasteland holding hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent, unpayable debt. I walked into my home office and slowly opened the bottom drawer of my heavy wooden desk, retrieving a pristine legal document. It was a formalized petition for an absolute divorce, carefully drafted by my attorney months in advance. The impending divorce decree was masterfully designed to ensure I maintained full, undisputed ownership of our current primary residence. The final execution phase of his absolute destruction was officially ready to begin. The sterile, echoing environment of a family law courtroom is the ultimate, unforgiving graveyard for a fraudulent marriage. Exactly 3 weeks after I handed him the finalized divorce petition in our living room, we found ourselves sitting on opposite sides of a heavy mahogany table in downtown Seattle. I had successfully filed an emergency protective order regarding our finances, legally forcing him to vacate our primary residence while the complex proceedings unfolded. He was currently renting a damp, microscopic studio apartment located in a highly undesirable neighborhood, entirely cut off from the luxurious comforts he had eagerly attempted to steal. He looked incredibly pale, his previously tailored suit now hanging off his diminishing frame like a discarded, oversized costume. His legal representation was exactly what I expected from a broken man whose wages were being aggressively garnished by multiple predatory collection agencies. He was sitting next to a visibly exhausted, unpolished attorney who had likely demanded a small, desperate cash retainer up front. In stark contrast, I was flanked by a remarkably sharp, highly expensive senior litigation partner who specialized exclusively in high-net-worth asset protection and complex financial fraud. My husband nervously tapped his cheap plastic pen against the wooden table, his eyes darting frantically around the intimidating courtroom, silently praying that the state community property laws would miraculously rescue him from absolute ruin. When the stern, unsmiling judge finally called our case, his chief attorney immediately launched into a predictable, entirely desperate legal argument. The lawyer loudly cited the standard marital statutes, aggressively claiming that because the massive $200,000 debt was acquired during the legal duration of our marriage, it was inherently a shared financial burden. He audaciously demanded that I be legally ordered to liquidate my protected assets to cover exactly half of the catastrophic obligations. He argued that his client had simply made a misguided, overly generous investment for his elderly mother, painting my husband as a tragic victim of a failing economy rather than a calculated, malicious predator. I sat perfectly still, my expression completely frozen into a mask of polite, indifferent observation. I did not interrupt, and I did not show a single ounce of anger. I simply waited for the incredibly foolish attorney to completely exhaust his pathetic, fabricated narrative. When the courtroom finally fell silent, my expensive litigation partner slowly stood up, respectfully addressing the bench. He did not bother arguing the emotional nuances of the failing marriage. Instead, he calmly lifted a massive, incredibly thick legal binder heavily categorized with bright red indexing tabs and placed it directly in front of the judge. As a senior software architect, my entire professional existence revolved around tracking complex digital footprints, identifying security vulnerabilities, and mapping hidden data networks. I had not just discovered the fraudulent loans, I had meticulously extracted the exact forensic history of every single transaction. My lawyer smoothly explained that the heavy binder contained verified, time-stamped server logs permanently linking every fraudulent credit application directly to my husband's specific corporate internet protocol address. We had successfully subpoenaed the digital records, proving absolutely that the electronic signatures were consistently executed from his personal mobile device and his heavily monitored workplace computer. The absolute devastation of the forensic evidence did not stop there. To completely obliterate his pathetic narrative of a joint marital investment, my attorney presented my own verified corporate security records. The precise timestamps of the fraudulent digital signatures perfectly aligned with the exact moments I was physically badging into highly restricted, monitored server rooms at my own technology firm. It was a mathematically impossible paradox for me to have authorized those massive loans. The digital evidence fundamentally transformed the severe debt from a simple marital dispute into a highly documented, incredibly severe case of malicious identity theft and premeditated financial fraud. The heavy silence in the courtroom became utterly suffocating as the judge carefully reviewed the undeniable forensic data. The deep frown on the judge's face hardened into a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. My husband's chief attorney visibly recoiled, physically inching away from his own client as he rapidly realized he had been fed a complete humiliating lie. The lawyer furiously whispered into my husband's ear, his face flushed with panicked anger, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the digital trap they had just blindly walked into. My lawyer then delivered the ultimate devastating ultimatum, his voice echoing cleanly across the quiet room. He politely informed the court that if my husband continued to fraudulently insist this debt was a shared marital asset, we would be legally obligated to forward the entire forensic binder directly to the federal authorities. We explicitly mentioned severe criminal charges, including federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and malicious bank fraud. The clinical, terrifying mention of a potential federal prison sentence hung in the cold air like a heavy, swinging guillotine. Sitting alone in the back row of the public gallery was his deeply entitled mother, wearing dark sunglasses to hide her heavily swollen, tear-stained eyes. The local bank had successfully finalized the aggressive foreclosure on her stolen luxury property, officially evicting her earlier that week. When she heard the terrifying threat of federal prison time for her beloved son, a loud, broken gasp escaped her throat. She finally understood that the catastrophic greed she had actively encouraged was about to put her only child behind cold iron bars. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the absolute finality of their complete destruction washed over her. My husband was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the polished wooden table. He was trapped in an impossible, terrifying paradox. If he bravely fought the debt in civil court, he would inevitably trigger a massive criminal investigation that would completely destroy his freedom. If he accepted the debt, he would shoulder 100% of the financial apocalypse alone, dragging his permanently ruined credit score into a lifetime of inescapable poverty. His hands shook violently as his furious attorney shoved a revised settlement agreement directly in front of him. With tears streaming down his defeated face, he slowly picked up the pen and officially signed away his future, legally accepting sole, exclusive responsibility for every single penny of the catastrophic debt he had created. The absolute finality of a stamped, legally binding divorce decree carries a profound physical weight. Exactly 6 months after the catastrophic courtroom confrontation, I stood in the sunlit foyer of my pristine suburban home, holding the documents that formally severed my existence from his entirely. The gold-embossed paper confirmed I retained absolute ownership of the primary residence, my corporate retirement accounts, and every asset locked inside the Montana Irrevocable Trust. The judge had aggressively enforced the settlement, legally tethering the massive, $200,000 fraudulent debt exclusively to his Social Security number. The sterile, suffocating anxiety that had plagued my existence for the past several months was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating peace. I was completely free. The sheer magnitude of his financial destruction had completely altered his reality. Because the corporate wage garnishments consumed the maximum allowable percentage of his marketing salary, his primary paycheck was effectively vaporized. His pristine credit score, the exact metric he had exploited to ruin me, was now a smoking crater. To avoid absolute homelessness and afford the exorbitant rent on his microscopic studio apartment, he was forced into the grueling gig economy. The arrogant executive who once flaunted an expensive vintage wristwatch was now spending his exhausted evenings frantically delivering fast food in a cheap, heavily dented compact car leased at a predatory interest rate. His entitled mother experienced an equally brutal fall from her fabricated pedestal. Her stolen luxury property had been liquidated by the banking institution at a public foreclosure auction. Stripped of her wealthy illusion, she moved into a tiny, subsidized senior living facility on the industrial outskirts of the city. I vividly witnessed her spectacular new reality during a routine weekend trip to a massive, heavily discounted warehouse club. I was casually pushing a heavy cart filled with premium organic groceries when I turned down the generic household supply aisle. Standing near the massive pallets of cheap paper towels was my former mother-in-law, wearing a highly unflattering, bright blue polyester employee vest over her tired shoulders. She was actively handing out tiny, microwave sausage samples to rushing customers. Her immaculate hair was visibly thinning, and the heavy designer makeup was replaced by the deep, exhausted lines of minimum-wage retail survival. She looked up and made direct, sustained eye contact with me. The plastic serving tray in her trembling hands rattled audibly against the metal table. I did not sneer, and I did not offer a gloating smile. I simply looked directly through her, entirely erasing her existence from my reality, as if she were an invisible ghost haunting the fluorescent aisles. I calmly selected a premium item and smoothly walked away, leaving the broken matriarch completely paralyzed by the suffocating weight of her own catastrophic irrelevance. The ultimate, poetic climax of their collective ruin arrived precisely 1 week later, during a violently stormy Friday evening. I had recently received a massive, highly lucrative corporate promotion, accompanied by a staggering financial bonus that solidified my absolute independence. To quietly celebrate my extraordinary professional victory, I ordered an incredibly expensive, multi-course seafood dinner from an elite downtown restaurant using a premium mobile delivery application. The torrential Seattle rain was violently thrashing against my heavy oak front door when the application notified me that my assigned driver was approaching the property. I casually walked toward the brightly lit foyer, wearing a luxurious pure silk bathrobe, holding a crystal glass of expensive imported champagne. When the doorbell sharply echoed through the quiet house, I smoothly unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the massive door open. Standing on my pristine, sheltered porch was my ex-husband. He was wearing a cheap, incredibly thin plastic rain poncho that offered absolutely no protection against the freezing, relentless downpour. His worn-out sneakers were completely soaked, and water aggressively dripped from his unkempt hair onto the perfectly sealed paper bags he was tightly clutching against his chest. He looked absolutely exhausted, his face gaunt and deeply shadowed by the crushing pressure of his high-interest financial prison. When he slowly raised his head and locked eyes with me, the sheer shock physically staggered him. He instinctively took a trembling step backward, almost dropping the heavy bags onto the slippery concrete. He had entirely failed to check the specific delivery name on the application, blindly rushing through the severe storm just to earn a pathetic microscopic delivery fee to survive his looming utility bills. He was now forcefully confronted by the exact woman he had maliciously attempted to destroy. Completely thriving in the luxurious sanctuary he was permanently banished from entering. "Clara," he whispered, his voice cracking violently, barely audible over the chaotic roar of the freezing rain. He stared at my relaxed posture, his exhausted eyes desperately searching for a single ounce of residual sympathy, lingering pity, or even basic human anger. He secretly wanted me to scream at him, because any emotional reaction would validate that he still mattered to me. He wanted the dramatic, satisfying closure of a screaming match to briefly distract him from his miserable, drowning reality. I deliberately denied him that final comfort. This was the exact, controversial boundary that permanently separates the survivors from the perpetual victims. A softer woman might have felt a sudden, fleeting pang of guilt seeing her former partner reduced to a shivering, broken delivery driver. But my empathy had been permanently incinerated the exact moment he forged my digital signature. I did not offer him a dry towel. I did not ask about his declining health. And I absolutely did not offer him a cash tip to ease his suffering. I simply extended my perfectly manicured hands, smoothly taking the expensive paper bags from his trembling, freezing grip. "Have a safe drive back into the city," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, perfectly mimicking the cold, automated corporate script he was forced to hear every single day. Before he could desperately formulate a pathetic response, I slowly and firmly pushed the heavy oak door completely shut, the solid metallic click of the deadbolt echoing with absolute finality. I smoothly walked back into my beautifully lit kitchen, leaving him standing entirely alone in the violent storm, forever trapped in the inescapable nightmare he originally built for me. The passage of time is the ultimate, undeniable validator of a perfectly executed strategy. Exactly 1 year after the final divorce decree was officially stamped by the family court judge, the chaotic drama that had briefly consumed my existence was reduced to a distant memory. I woke up early on a crisp, beautifully clear Sunday morning, the vibrant Seattle sunrise casting long, golden shadows across the polished hardwood floors of my massive suburban home. I poured myself a steaming cup of expensive dark roast coffee, breathing in the rich aroma, entirely unbothered by the parasitic presence that had once polluted this exact kitchen. The suffocating silence of the massive house, which my ex-husband had arrogantly assumed would eventually drive me insane with loneliness, had actually become my ultimate, impenetrable sanctuary. I walked slowly down the long driveway to retrieve the morning mail, wrapping my thick cashmere cardigan tightly around my shoulders to block the biting chill of the autumn wind. Buried underneath a small stack of glossy corporate catalogs was a thick, officially sealed envelope from the federal bankruptcy court. I slowly slid my polished thumbnail under the heavy paper flap, revealing a desperate, highly detailed legal petition for a Chapter 7 bankruptcy discharge. My ex-husband had finally reached the absolute bottom of his humiliating financial descent, desperately begging a federal judge to magically wipe away the hundreds of thousands of dollars in catastrophic, high-interest debt that he was fundamentally incapable of repaying. I leaned against the smooth granite countertop of my pristine kitchen, carefully reading through the desperate legal filings while casually sipping my warm coffee. He had officially listed his current primary occupation as an independent delivery contractor, reporting an annual gross income so pathetically low that it barely surpassed the federal poverty line. He had explicitly included every single maxed-out credit card, the predatory personal loans, and the astronomical deficiency balance remaining from the violent repossession of his luxury sedan. He was desperately attempting to utilize the federal bankruptcy system as an emergency escape hatch, hoping to finally restart his miserable life completely free from the aggressive collection agencies that haunted his every waking moment. However, he had made one final, catastrophic miscalculation in his desperate bid for legal salvation. Because my expensive litigation partner had successfully introduced the undeniable forensic digital evidence during our aggressive divorce proceedings, the massive debt was not officially classified as standard, forgivable consumer spending. It was legally categorized as a severe financial obligation directly resulting from malicious, documented identity theft and premeditated fraud. Under the strict federal bankruptcy codes, debts explicitly incurred through proven, deliberate fraud are absolutely, permanently non-dischargeable. The federal judge would inevitably review the devastating forensic history, immediately reject his desperate petition, and permanently chain him to the compounding financial corpse for the rest of his natural life. Later that exact same afternoon, I confidently dialed the personal telephone number of my estranged aunt residing in rural Montana. It was finally time to quietly dismantle the flawless, invisible fortress I had carefully constructed to protect my hard-earned wealth. Because the aggressive divorce was entirely finalized and the statutory deadlines for any potential civil appeals had officially expired, there was absolutely no remaining legal threat to my massive corporate assets. I instructed my aunt, who had served as the sole, unyielding trustee of the irrevocable trust, to officially initiate the complex legal dissolution process. Within a few short weeks, the massive investment portfolios and the lucrative joint savings accounts would seamlessly flow back into my direct, exclusive control, completely untouched by the spectacular financial apocalypse that had annihilated my former partner. My aunt briefly asked if I harbored any lingering regrets about the uncompromising brutality of the trap I had so patiently designed. I stared out the massive windows of my quiet home office, watching the colorful autumn leaves slowly fall onto the perfectly manicured lawn. I calmly explained that a highly complex digital system is only as secure as its absolute weakest vulnerability. My ex-husband had arrogantly believed that my unwavering dedication and my pristine credit score were structural weaknesses he could easily exploit to fund his family's unearned luxury. I simply reprogrammed those exact traits into a highly aggressive, deeply defensive firewall, actively allowing his own unrestrained greed to serve as the ultimate, destructive virus that completely dismantled his reality. The incredibly toxic, deeply entitled matriarch who had enthusiastically encouraged his massive betrayal was now a completely forgotten, invisible entity. I occasionally heard distant rumors through mutual acquaintances that she was still trapped in her tiny, subsidized apartment, constantly complaining to anyone who would listen about the terrible daughter-in-law who had supposedly stolen her luxurious retirement. Her son, the arrogant marketing executive who had proudly forged my signature to buy her affection, no longer answered her frantic, demanding telephone calls. Their fraudulent parasitic alliance had completely disintegrated under the crushing pressure of inescapable poverty, leaving them entirely isolated in their own separate, miserable realities. As the golden sun began to slowly set behind the towering city skyline, my mobile phone suddenly illuminated on the heavy wooden desk. It was an incoming call from a completely blocked, unidentified number. I casually let the call divert directly to my secure digital voicemail system, waiting patiently for the automated transcription to generate on the glowing screen. It was my ex-husband, calling from a cheap, prepaid public telephone. His voice was incredibly weak, trembling violently as he left a pathetic, rambling message, tearfully apologizing for his massive betrayal and desperately begging for a tiny, temporary personal loan just to keep his current landlord from violently evicting him. "I have absolutely nothing left, Clara. And I know you finally won," the automated text transcription coldly displayed across my bright screen. I did not feel a sudden, overwhelming surge of triumphant joy, nor did I feel the slightest, lingering hint of moral guilt. I simply felt an immense, profoundly deep emptiness regarding his entire existence. He was no longer a genuine threat, a frustrating nuisance, or even a recognizable human being in my meticulously structured universe. He was simply a successfully neutralized error code, permanently deleted from the primary operating system of my life. I calmly pressed the small red icon, permanently erasing the pathetic voicemail before he even finished his desperate sentence. I slowly closed the heavy laptop, walking back out into my beautiful, peaceful house, completely ready to enjoy the rest of my quiet, perfectly secure life.